Hi, everyone. My name is Matt Roberts. For those of you who don't know me, I am leading the Lifecycle Assessment and Embodied Carbon Research Program here at CBE. Today, I get to give you a fun presentation with some updates of the various pieces of work we have on the go. To give you a quick overview, the presentation is going to be split into three main sections, highlighting some key takeaways from a critical literature review that we completed over the summer. Followed by some quick updates on some MEP case study analysis that I am doing with Riv, who you met back in April, and she's here today. So please come up and talk to us after the presentation to learn more about that. And then I'm going to be giving you a bit more of an introduction on one of the upcoming projects that Gail mentioned in her introduction today, where we've been selected for funding through the Environmental Protection Agency. So to give you a bit of background, why we're here today and why we got to the point of doing a critical lit review of LCAs of MEP studies. So back in April, I presented on the California Carbon Report that was published in collaboration with the Carbon Leadership Forum. This study focused on 30 building scale life cycle assessments completed by practitioners within the state of California. In that analysis, none of the buildings included the environmental impacts of MEP systems. So we know that was a huge gap in the analysis there, so we wanted to target that. Beyond MEP systems, refrigerants weren't included, biogenic carbon wasn't included, and a few other key building elements and life cycle stages were not included in that analysis. So to start things off, we wanted to look at MEP systems because of the rich history of CBE focusing on those components. So we did a critical lit review focusing on academic journal publications that included MEP systems within building scale assessments. So looking at the literature on a whole, since 2016, there's been about 180,000 publications looking at buildings and life cycle assessment. However, from doing a bit more filtering down, there's about 37 papers that were suitable for critique and inclusion in this assessment. So the whole point was to basically identify the issues of completeness, comparability, transparency, and interpreting the results that are published in literature. And this work's been funded through the CBE Consortium as well as ClimateWorks Foundation. So from those 37 studies, 60 MEP configurations were reported. So some of the studies had different comparisons across different typologies and systems. 18 countries are covered around the world. Refrigerants are included in 5 of those publications. So refrigerants as a target search was not included because we wanted to look at the embodied impacts of the systems themselves. However, refrigerant leakage is included within life cycle stage B1 and is considered embodied impact. So in order to be included in this assessment, they needed to be an attributional life cycle assessment, so they needed to be descriptive. They needed to provide a midpoint assessment to be able to consider and look at the environmental impacts related to climate change or global warming potential individually. They need to be able to describe the systems as stated in the article, as well as the LCA methodology. This was key, and a lot of the papers did not do that. And we needed to be able to interpret the results, obviously. So in terms of the life cycle stages that were reported, all of the studied or reviewed literature included A1 to A3. So this is the cradle to gate impacts for producing the components and materials used in the systems. And then roughly half of the studies included some form of transportation and construction impacts, as well as replacement, which is B4. And we saw a range of single-family, multifamily, commercial, and other buildings, which was mostly public assembly, education, and lab facilities. So in terms of the normalized environmental impacts relative to building area, it was quite a spread. And looking at the zoomed-in section, there really isn't any correlation. Now, what that is saying versus what that isn't saying is we can't really say if there's correlation based off building area, building typology, or system typology, because a lot of the interpretability of these results was hindered based off of how the results were published. So you can't really say whether an impact or a building was high impact due to the systems that were included or the relative scope of the building elements that were included in the assessment themselves. And what we also really saw was the fact that simplifying assumptions were really underrepresenting the impacts. So in this graph and the following graph, we have the impacts split out to A1 to A3, A1 to A5, and what's called single values. So these single values are when publications include one single number for the environmental impacts of the MEP systems across some scope of life cycle stages and system components. So we don't really know what's driving it, whether it's A1 to A3 or a high replacement impact in B4 or the type of systems that are included within those. Removing the area portion of it and just looking at it as a box plot, again, we're seeing quite a spread where A1 to A3 and A1 to A5 are quite comparable to each other. But because MEP systems are typically excluded from building scale assessments, we wanted to include some form of lower bound estimate that you guys can use in your assessments when no information is known or you don't want to do an assessment. So from the literature, we're saying that that is around 50 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared. And the replacements are typically around 2 replacements over a 60-year reference study period, which would lead to the B4 impacts, which include transportation and construction on site of the replacement, would be around 125 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared. Now, we know these are lower bound estimates because there were a few studies that were very exemplary in how they disclosed and compared and reported both the environmental impacts, the life cycle inventory or the scope of what was included in the assessment, as well as how they described the methodology that they used. So some of these, they're going to be highlighted in red. So HOXA, one of the most detailed studies that there were from the literature, had 100 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per meter squared for A1 to A3. Perali was 163, and then Pesca was 63. So all these are above the lower estimate. So we want to basically iterate this estimate over time and improve it. So just some key takeaways, and these are more generalizable. Some best practices for LCA is they need to be transparent. Basically, the whole point is that you want someone else to be able to know and understand what you did in your assessment, so it's comparable and interpretable. Disaggregation of results is key to be able to understand what is driving the environmental impacts. So what we saw with the single value estimates isn't really sufficient for reporting, and it should be discouraged at all points of time. So you want to include environmental impacts reported by life cycle stage and system component as well. So arguably, the more detail there is, the better. From the literature, we identified 10 specific key areas of research for life cycle assessments of MEP systems that can largely be summarized into these 3 groups of guidance for guidance value development, which is basically iterating that 50 kilograms of CO2 equivalent value to be more representative. Ideally, we want to get system typology benchmarks, building typology benchmarks, geographic benchmarks, and a few other more categorical comparisons. Improved reporting practices. So in the publication that's under review currently, we have a list of basically aspects or things within the life cycle assessment that you should report and include to be able to give the results to someone else and then be able to interpret it to as good of a degree as possible. And we want to transition away from purely descriptive results in studies to more investigative studies. So describing the environmental impacts of a building is great, but we're in a climate crisis and we need to drive emissions down. So we want to go towards more of this is the impact, this is what the impact could be, and these are some strategies of reducing the impact for other buildings to then learn from the studies that we're doing.